The whole town takes turns covering an old stone well. No one would tell me why until they decided it was finally my turn. Subscribe now, because this story only gets harder to walk away from the longer I lived in that town. 3 years ago, I moved to a small rural town called Marrow Creek for a quiet, affordable place to restart my life after a difficult divorce. The town itself seemed pleasant enough on the surface, close-knit, old-fashioned, the kind of place where everyone genuinely knew their neighbors. It took me nearly a year to notice the one strange, consistent detail running underneath that ordinary small-town charm. At the center of a small communal park sat an old stone well, weathered and clearly ancient, kept permanently covered by a heavy wooden lid reinforced with iron bands. What I gradually noticed was that the lid was never left unattended. A rotating schedule, maintained quietly and informally among longtime residents, ensured someone was always physically present near that well, day and night, watching it in shifts that never seemed to overlap with gaps. I assumed initially it was some kind of historical preservation effort, protecting an old structure from vandalism or accidental injury. When I asked a neighbor directly about it, an older woman named Mrs. Kessler, who'd lived in Marrow Creek her entire life, she simply told me it was tradition, the kind of answer people give when they'd rather not explain something further. Over the following 2 years, I settled fully into town life, building genuine friendships, feeling more at home than I had in years. The well itself became so normalized in my daily awareness that I stopped consciously noticing the constant rotation of quiet watchers stationed near it, the way you stop noticing background details in any environment you've lived in long enough. That changed the evening Mrs. Kessler and 2 other longtime residents showed up unannounced at my front door, informing me, with the same calm, matter-of-fact tone she'd used discussing tradition years earlier, that it was now my turn to take a watch shift. I laughed at first, assuming this was some kind of community initiation joke. Her expression made clear immediately that it wasn't. She explained, briefly and with visible reluctance, that every resident who'd lived in Marrow Creek long enough eventually took their turn in the rotation, and that refusing wasn't something the town had ever really allowed as an option, not out of any formal rule, but simply because the watch had never once, in living memory, gone uncovered for even a single hour. I asked directly, for the first time in 3 years, what exactly we were watching for. Mrs. Kessler hesitated for a long moment before telling me only that the well needed to remain covered at all times, and that the schedule existed to ensure that lid was never left unattended long enough for anyone or anything to move it without immediate notice. I took my first shift skeptically, expecting nothing beyond a quiet, uneventful few hours sitting near an old stone structure in a park. Around 2 a.m., I heard it for the first time, a slow, deliberate scraping sound coming from beneath the heavy wooden lid, as though something on the other side were testing its weight, methodically, patiently, the way you'd test a door you suspected might eventually give way. I sat frozen, watching the lid for any visible movement, my rational mind cycling through every possible mundane explanation, even as every instinct told me none of them adequately accounted for what I was hearing. The sound continued intermittently for nearly an hour before finally stopping entirely, the silence afterwards somehow more unsettling than the noise itself had been. I asked Mrs. Kessler directly the following morning what was actually down there. She told me, with the same weary resignation I now recognized as characteristic of every longtime resident who'd ever discussed the well with me, that no one currently alive actually knew for certain that the tradition predated any living memory of its original purpose, and that generations of residents had simply maintained the watch faithfully because the one time, decades earlier, that it had briefly lapsed, 3 residents had disappeared from town within the following week, never found, never explained. I've taken my regular rotation ever since, along with every other adult resident of Marrow Creek, none of us fully understanding what exactly we're protecting the town from, only that the watch has never lapsed again since that one documented incident, and that none of us are willing to be the generation that tests whether it actually needs to continue. I think about leaving town sometimes, moving somewhere without any inherited obligation to sit awake at 2 a.m., listening to something scrape patiently at the underside of a lid that's held for generations. But I've also come to understand something about Marrow Creek that outsiders never quite grasp. Sometimes a community's most important tradition isn't the one they can fully explain, but the one they've simply agreed, generation after generation, is worth maintaining regardless of whether anyone still remembers exactly why.